Welcome to the Mindbeat podcast by Effective School Solutions. I'm your host, Duncan Young, CEO of Effective School Solutions.
And I'm your co-host, Laine Whitaker, Senior Director, Professional Learning at Effective School Solutions.
The Mindbeat podcast is the definitive source for all topics related to school-based mental health, from sharing best practices to highlighting innovative school districts to keeping track of legislation. Mindbeat is the go-to source for educators and administrators looking to implement a mental health care continuum. Together, we can make a difference in school-based mental health care and in the lives of students, families, and educators. Let's get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Mindbeat podcast. I'm Duncan Young, CEO of Effective School Solutions.
And I'm Laine Whitaker, Senior Director, Professional Learning at Effective School Solutions.
We've got a great episode for you today. We're going to be joined very shortly by John Zogby, who is Senior Partner of John Zogby Strategies, which is one of the nation's preeminent polling firms. We've had the opportunity to partner with John and his firm to commission a nationwide survey on administrator and parent attitudes about school-based mental health. Really important work. We're going to talk about some of the insights that John and his team have from that survey, and we could not be more thrilled about that discussion. How you doing today, Laine?
I'm doing well, Duncan. How about you?
Good. Thanks. So we've had our podcast out for a couple of weeks. Any feedback from friends and family or customers, any folks that we work with?
Yes. Well, definitely from folks we work with, which has been lovely. I've got a lot of great comments through LinkedIn and some other places where we put the podcast, our notifications for it out. But I think the most touching response was from my son. My son is 18, my one and only child, and he's in college now, a freshman. And when I sent him the episode, we both have Spotify, so I sent it to him with a Spotify link, and he wrote back, "Listen to the podcast, Mom. I'm really proud of you." And that just made me so happy. I can't tell you how both satisfying and heartwarming that was to hear from him. So cool. I feel cool in this in his eyes, and I'm really excited about the podcast. And so
it sounds like age 18 is the age at which kind of a child realizes that their parent can actually have a positive contribution to broader society. It is not just kind of a, anchor on their broader life and whatnot. So that's a good sign.
Maybe. I don't know. My kid might be a little unique. I'm not sure. But, some kids may recognize it sooner. Some may recognize it later. But I'm glad it's happening now. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, so my kids are a little bit younger, and I would say I got a little bit of eye rolling when they heard the podcast. Sure. But and then I had an awkward moment yesterday where I had LinkedIn up on my phone, mm-hmm. and just coincidentally enough, it had one of the audio ads for the podcast kind of on there. And so as I was shutting down my phone to go into this meeting, I accidentally kind of hit the screen and it activated the audio, and I heard my voice kind of talking. And so I shut it off really quickly, but the rest of the folks in the meeting were like, "Are you listening to yourself on your podcast?" So it was kind of like, no, really, let me explain. So a little bit of an awkward moment there. But,
how do you feel about hearing your own voice? I'm still getting used to that, I have to admit.
It's
a little weird.
It's definitely a little bit off-putting. So, but you get used to it. So, why don't we jump right in today? I'm really excited about getting to John and our conversation with him. But why don't you kick us off with our top 3 list for today?
Yes, as we do every episode, we're going to get started with our weekly top 3, where we share 3 big ideas in response to key mental health questions. So today's top 3 is 3 hurdles to youth receiving mental health care. So my 3 hurdles that I think are the main problems are, number 1, stigma. There's social, religious, cultural, and familial stigmas around mental health that do create a barrier to support. I think a lot of families will sort of minimize symptoms or, and sort of be in denial about some of the things that are happening with kids. I think that some families actually have a fear that if they go to therapy that they might spill all the tea, so to speak, or tell all of the family business. And so that may create a barrier to care. I think, when I used to be an administrator at a charter school, and we had a student there who expressed that she was hearing voices, and a lot of her symptoms were consistent with schizophrenia. And when we shared this with the parents, what she was complaining of, they sort of minimized it and said, well, we'll take it to prayer. We'll see what happens. And so I think that there's some challenges, again, around both religious, social, family, cultural stigmas that prevent kids from getting the health care or the mental health care that they need. I think my number 2 would be access. And within that, I kind of have some subgroups, but one of which is insurance coverage. I think that many families don't necessarily qualify for Medicaid, but they don't necessarily have sufficient coverage in their healthcare plans if they have healthcare at all. So that is a real barrier. And then kind of B of that is that it's harder to to find providers in rural or economically depressed areas. I know when I used to work in Trenton too, transportation, believe it or not, I know it was a city, but transportation was sometimes an issue for kids just getting to therapy. And then I would say is my number 3, wait lists for new patients. Believe it or not, because of all the rise in mental health care, it's really difficult for people to get in right away. It could be weeks or months before you can get on a caseload for a mental health care provider. So that is my top 3. I don't know if you have anything to add to that or any comments on my top 3.
I mean, the only comments I would make, I think on the stigma piece, I mean, one of my hopes here is that one of the, positive legacies of all the negative things that took place kind of during COVID was the fact that I do think we are probably in a different environment right now when it comes to stigmatization of mental health. And certainly there is still stigma out there. My observation and my hope combination would be that we're in a little bit of a better position now than kind of we were, say, 5 or even kind of 3 years ago. The other point I want to make here is just really when it comes to mental health care right now, I think it's all about equity and it's all about access. I think those are 2 really important pieces. Your conversations about access to me just really highlight the importance of schools as delivery points for high quality mental health care because, especially if mental health care services are being provided kind of by the school with supplemental funding and their reliance on their ability to bill out to Medicaid and things of that nature. Ultimately, I think that's a key piece of us creating kind of a more equitable kind of access, platform for mental health care overall, because all students are going to school, and that can be kind of a common denominator access point for a lot of young people. So it's a big part of the equation.
I do agree. That's why what we do is so important in schools. Absolutely.
Agree. So why don't we shift gears to our news story for today? The news story, and again, as with all of our news stories, you'll find access to these on our website and on our social media feeds, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And I know I said on my last podcast, Twitter, if it is still around in 2 weeks, and apparently it's still around, so that's good. Maybe, hopefully, at the time of folks are listening to this, Twitter will still be there. Who knows? Who knows what's going to be happening there? So. The title of this article, and this is on CNN Health, it is Teens' Brains Age Faster During the First Year of the Pandemic, study says, and stress may be to blame. So there's been a tremendous amount of research, I think, in the last year, the last 2 years on the impact of the pandemic on mental health symptoms. The study described in this article is probably like the most detailed in terms of looking at kind of the biological kind of drivers of what's actually taking place with kind of, brain functioning and brain chemistry. So this is describing an article or a research study from the journal Biological Psychiatry. And as the title indicates, the study found that teen brains aged faster during the pandemic. And the background of the study was interesting. So this was a group of researchers who were actually looking at gender differences in kind of brain development. And they took a bunch of students aged 9 to 13, and their goal was beginning like 6 years ago to do functional MRIs of these students' brains every 2 years. And the study got interrupted by the pandemic. And so, and they took 2 years off. And when they came back, they actually decided to continue to do their gender differences study, but they also said, hey, wait, we've got kind of like this really interesting data set of functional MRIs from before the pandemic and functional MRIs from after the pandemic. Let's just take a look at whether or not there's a difference in kind of, what brains actually look like. And what they found was that portions of the brain had actually grown much faster than normal kind of during the pandemic. So, and this is one of my favorite, words describing a part of the brain, but it's the amygdala. So the amygdala is the portion of the brain that regulates fear and stress that actually kind of develop much more rapidly than, it normally would for students of this age group. And then the hippocampus, which actually controls access to memories, also grew much faster. And then the portion of the brain that actually controls like decision making and executive function, that actually thinned out. So that actually was like very stunted in its development. And so the hypothesis here is that all of these things together help to explain some of the mental health challenges that we're seeing with students. We've actually got students who have had to kind of respond a lot more to fear and stress. We've got maybe issues with kind of access to memories. I wonder if that has to do with like brain fog and this dynamic that we all have during COVID, that it seems like time has no meaning and 1 month seems like a year or a year seems like a month, kind of, et cetera. And then of course, kind of executive functioning, students' ability to self-regulate and to self-regulate their schedules during like periods of remote learning. We know how challenging that was. All of these things together, I think, can help to explain, at least in part, some of the mental health challenges that students have seen at a heightened level during COVID.
Sure. I mean, this is a lot of the work that we do with teachers in schools, describing exactly what you just articulated very well about the brain function, the hippocampus and the amygdala, that, high amounts of cortisol and adrenaline cause a lot of, horrific impacts on those areas of the brain. So I think, that we already knew that was on the rise pre-pandemic, and now it's sort of a universal ACE for everyone. So now, a lot of kids are dealing with those same type of challenges, whereas before the pandemic, it was on the rise.
I would agree. Yeah. And I'm gonna nominate amygdala as one of my top 10 favorite words of all time. Yeah? Just a great word. I could say it. I could say it all day. So maybe the amygdala can be the official brain component of the MindBeat podcast. Well,
okay,
I'll
go with that.
Got it.
Go with that.
All right. Well, without further ado, I would love to move to introducing our guest for today. Our guest is John Zogby. As I mentioned before, John is the senior partner of John Zogby Strategies. John is a pollster, author, trend spotter, and thought leader. He spent the past 4 decades as one of the most accurate pollsters in the world. He's conducted business in over 80 countries and really specializes in finding meaning, story, direction, and helping to make sense of data that he and his team collect. His client list is a who's who of Fortune 500 companies like GE, Microsoft, Cisco, Coca-Cola. And he's also worked with a tremendous number of government agencies, the U.S. State Department, U.S. DOD, the mayors of New York City, Houston, and Miami. He is a former senior advisor at the Belfer Center of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He is the first senior fellow at the Institute of Policy Research and Catholic Studies at the Catholic University of America. He has received an unbelievable 3 honorary doctorates. I think you and I are still working on our first one, right, Laine? And
sure.
1 Chancellor's Award for Excellence. And his 3 sons have followed in his footsteps and work with him in his current organization, John Zogby Strategies. He lives with his wife, Kathy, who is a former special education teacher, so very relevant to our conversation today. And she's also a children's book author, and they live in upstate New York, right near the great city of Utica. John, welcome to the MindBeat podcast. We're really excited for you to join us today.
Yes, we are.
Duncan and Laine, thank you so much again for the opportunity to work with you, and to work with you on a topic that we not only have work experience, but life experience as well. I was a teacher, and mental health has been a passion of mine and my wife's personally for many years. So this was a labor of love, and I appreciate that.
John, what did you teach? What subject?
History and political science.
Okay.
Oh,
excellent.
Very nice. I was a poli-sci major myself. I was also a former educator. So thank you so much for being on the podcast. We're really excited to have this conversation with you. So first, can you tell our listeners a little bit more about your background and kind of how you became an expert in the world of polling, and how have you evolved in this field?
So as I mentioned, I was a teacher, community college and the State University of New York, going back to the 70s. I was also a left-wing political activist at the same time. And that culminated in a run for mayor of Utica. I came in third in a Democratic primary with 3 candidates. So that'll tell you something. But I did a poll with my students, and I knew exactly how much I was going to lose by. This is a true story. And I guess that the old Thomas Marshall quote, "I'd rather be right than president." I've always been fascinated by polls. And so by the mid-'80s, I started John Zogby and Associates, and I did the Blue Highways approach. If you know the work of William Least Heat Moon, I didn't have the giant clientele. I was the one who went into the small cities and towns and the candidate for sheriff as opposed to the candidate for governor. That's how I spent the 1980s, but built it really then from the bottom up.
Very cool.
So John, tell us about the survey that we just worked on together. Who did you talk to, and what questions were we trying to answer as part of this?
Sure. We did two separate surveys, with one of 200, let's call it senior school officials, decision makers, so superintendents, assistant superintendents, principals, and the like. And then we did, this is nationwide, of course, and a nationwide survey of 1,000 parents of K through 12 students, essentially asking them with a few tweaks here and there, the same exact questions about mental health. Mental health is a priority, the confidence in the school system in dealing with mental health, satisfaction, lack of satisfaction, the next steps in the future. It's a pretty comprehensive survey, about 25 questions altogether.
So what did that survey tell you about the state of mental health then? Those were some great questions. What did it reveal?
Well, it's acute. I mean, 90% of school administrators said that it was a serious or moderately serious challenge. 70% of parents, that there's a recognition, as Duncan was pointing out just a little earlier, that this is a time when mental health is on the radar screen. We all remember when it was not on the radar screen at all. And the sense also from the survey that while a sense that progress is being made in identifying the problem, that it is still a serious and growing problem for school districts.
John, I think one of the things the survey also looked at was kind of trends, right? Because we're obviously in a super dynamic and rapidly changing environment when it comes to school-based mental health and our insights as to what's going on. What did the survey tell us about some of the trends? Anything in particular taking place over the last year, say?
Well, I think so, sure. I think the top line here is that 2/3 of the school administrators said that in the last year, the issue, the problem of mental health has either stayed the same or gotten worse. And that was 80, then compare that with 85% of parents. So that's what we're talking about, recognition. When I see numbers that high, we're looking at a community or we're looking at a consensus.
Got it.
So in other words, this is not only on the radar screen, it's a priority.
Yeah, one of the things I really noticed in here too is the marked difference between the overall respondents in rural areas. I think that the number in rural areas was something like also 85% in terms of versus the 65% or so with the broader population who said that mental health challenges had degraded. And I think that seems to track with what we've been reading about and hearing with respect to clinician shortages and shortage of mental health care providers in rural areas.
Well, yeah, for many of us, this is an urban country, a metropolitan country, and life in the rural areas is invisible to many of us, perhaps most of all to policymakers. And so here was a statement that, just as we learned a couple of decades ago about drug problems and unwed parenthood, teen parenthood, and so on, the issue of mental health is seen as even more acute in rural areas than in either larger urban areas or larger school districts, because we broke things down by school district sizes as well.
So, John, you heard me mention, or perhaps you heard me mention at the top of the podcast, that I cited as one of the 3 hurdles to getting mental health care for kids was stigma, and a lot of times it's familial stigma. So I'm curious, what did the survey tell you about parents' attitudes about whether schools should be providing mental health support for their children?
Well, it's interesting that while the superintendents, listed it as the highest priority, among parents, it was split as to whether the highest priority or a priority. And I think a lot of that has to do, Lynn, with what you pointed out, that it's still a stigma, that it's still a NIMBY sort of thing, not my child, it's somebody else's child, hence not the biggest priority for me. And I think going forward, that's going to be a hurdle. I know that you're going to ask me a little later for some thoughts on where I think we need to move forward, and I'll just tantalize you right now.
So John, when it comes to confidence level of districts that they have and their ability to provide mental health services to students, what did administrators tell us, and what did parents tell us? How are they feeling about the readiness of the system to help be part of the mental health care continuum in a school-based environment?
Well, about 3 in 4 of the school administrators felt that they were confident in addressing the issue. That's a nuanced result. Now, I'll explain that in a second. 3 out of 5, or around 60% of parents, were confident. Now, where's the nuance come in? I think that administrators, and to become an administrator means you've been around for a while. I think what they're confident in the fact that they're implementing and making changes and creating programs as they go along. So there is the confidence level. Had we asked, are you confident that the crisis has been eradicated, that would have been a different question. Parents, 60% are confident. That's good. But I think, those who are not confident, that could very well be the fear that other kids aren't being dealt with, not anything about my kids.
Got it. I think that's a great point. So it sounds like with administrators, the distinction you're drawing there might be a statement of confidence that initiatives are being implemented, but not necessarily a statement of confidence about whether or not those initiatives are achieving the desired result.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, again, if we go back even to our own experiences, look at what we're talking about today. We couldn't talk about this 20-10 years ago. The stigma was that great. Sure. I'd like to point out that in terms of my experience, we've done 75, 80 school districts over the last 30 years, getting into many of these, sex, drugs, rock and roll, everything. We've polled middle schoolers and high schoolers. In addition to that, I have written pretty extensively, both books and articles about age cohorts. And this is none of this is a surprise to me, because with each age cohort, the younger you get, the more acute are the issues of stress, psychological damage, suicide. We're at Gen Z right now, and we thought maybe things had peaked with millennials, who up to that point had been the most stressed out of the age cohorts, but Gen Z even more so.
That's great point.
Good point. So I'm going to shift the focus a little bit. Let's talk about funding. So, you know, we highlighted that one of the silver linings of the pandemic has been that now mental health is on the radar. In our previous episode, we talked a lot about federal funding for mental health in schools. So I'm curious what your polls revealed about administrators' feelings and attitudes about funding mental health initiatives.
It's interesting because just about half and half felt that they need more information about funding. Now, to be honest, we had out of 200 school officials, when you break it down to rural areas, you've got a small subsample. But I think in particular, you'd find you can extrapolate a little bit that particularly in rural areas, there is a sense that something is being missed. And that is is there sufficient funding? Are there sufficient resources in general? But yeah, half felt that they had enough information. Half, give or take a few points, felt that they needed more information.
Well, it's changing so quickly too. I mean, we, as an organization, this is all we focus on. It's hard for us to keep track of it sometimes. I mean, you've got your federal tranche of dollars, and those programs are changing all the time. But then every state has its own kind of specific set of initiatives focused on mental health or on school-based mental health. And I can certainly appreciate how challenging it could be for a superintendent in a rural environment to keep tabs on all of that.
For sure. I'm curious too, so when you talk about rural areas versus maybe more urban or suburban areas, are you saying that the polls reveal that there's just less resources in those areas, or that the attitudes are different about mental health?
No, the sense, at least from this question, that more resources are going to be needed. I mean, what was clear, just with the several questions that we've just been dealing with, is that yes, we've made progress, but we do know that there's a whole lot more to do. But as Duncan points out, it's moving so quickly. It's, that's not going to come out of property taxes.
Right.
That's for sure. We're talking about massive investments. But there's a recognition here that this is a priority issue.
So, John, let's shift a little bit to, this might be a good segue into some of the solutions conversation. But, what did the survey reveal in terms of priorities for educators and parents about where they think that focus is needed when it comes to mental health in schools?
Well, professional training, in particular for staff. There was a concern that while they may have a handle on one student or one issue, what if multiple issues came about? A need for more coordination with the rest of the community and other agencies. I think we have a clear path here that schools don't want to be, they don't want to be in their role of, we used to use the term in loco parentis. Here, drop your kid off at school, and then for 8 hours, you don't have to deal with them every day. The school's got it. Well, that can't exist.
Yeah, the other thing that really jumped out at me in the results was around screening, right? And this is something we talked about in our last episode, but and I think the way it was worded in the survey was roughly half, and I'm going off memory here, of respondents said that they needed more help in identifying students who might be flying under the radar screen or who might not be kind of on the district's kind of, that they might not be aware that they have kind of a mental health challenge. And I think that gets into some interesting policy discussions around the need for universal mental health screening. How can districts kind of be kind of more proactive around that?
And as you know, this brings up the political issue as well of parental rejection, much like they reject vaccines in many instances, or critical race theory, whatever that is, which is not being taught anywhere, actually. But the whole notion then of my kid's privacy. On the other hand, this is something that has to be done. How many times do we see when there's an acute crisis, someone saying, if we'd only known?
I agree with that. When I was from 6th grade through my junior year of high school, my mother was dying of cancer. And I didn't have any behavior problems, but I did have a lot of academic problems. I now know today, I used to feel a lot of shame over that as a child, but I now know that I didn't have the bandwidth, that we talked about the amygdala and the hippocampus, and there is a shrinking of the hippocampus when there is extreme amount of stress. And so now I have some empathy and compassion for my youth. But I remember thinking how much I would love to speak to a mental health professional, and this was in the late 90s, and what behavior would I have to manifest or make up, if you will, so that I could get the help that I needed or have someone to talk to. And to your point, Duncan, when you don't show these acute signs, or when you're not a real behavior problem or challenging, that doesn't mean that you don't also need some support with mental health. So yeah, I agree with that there needs to be some type of screening or some way to get kids that may not be on the radar with behavior problems.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing that. And I think that does highlight, I'm kind of reflecting on how different I think that would be today in most communities. I think you probably would have more access now, hopefully, than you would have had kind of in the late 90s. I think John, you're bringing up a really good point about some of the inherent tensions here. When I think about the next 5 years, about how this is going to evolve, I think that's going to be probably a national and regional and even local in some cases, school board by school board debate about the tension between identifying students who need care and some of these questions around kind of parental choice and privacy and things of that nature. So I think it's going to be I think the lines are drawn for that debate here to take place here in the coming years.
Yeah, absolutely. I was struck right before we started the podcast, and I jotted down a couple of notes, that one of the great American anthropologists was a fellow, we're going back 50, 60 years, Ashley Montagu, and wrote a lot about race and racism. And what particularly moved me about his work on racism is that he devoted an entire appendix to the city of Springfield in the 1940s, where there was a sense that racism was percolating and brewing. And the mayor convened a series of town hall public meetings, and they defined racism as a community issue that required a plethora of resources, and that they defined that what they needed to do was an inoculation. I loved that term. Early intervention, inoculation, not the overworked school psychologist down the hall who's got 18 students outside her door waiting to be counseled, but, a community-wide effort where all resources are pooled in. That would be how I would approach this issue, either as a national community or state community, or even on a local level. Define it as a priority, mental health as a priority, bring parents into the process early. Outreach to the broader community as well to define where the resources are, early screening and a premium on new diagnostics, and then triage with, as you're seeing in the battle on crime, rather than sending two cops, chasing after someone, you got a social worker and a physician all there, and then you decide on the spot, who takes the lead. So it's out there, and the solutions are out there. Now it needs the will and obviously the funding.
Yeah, and I think I think we're fortunate right now in that, public attention and the attention of media and the attention of society, I think, is more focused on this than it ever has before. So I'm really hopeful that that's going to translate into some of the productive policy discussions in the way that you're describing.
So I'm curious, if you could change, or if you had all-encompassing power, if you could wave your magic wand, what are some of the things or what if any aspect of school-based mental health care would you change? I have a feeling where it might go, given what we've talked about already, but I'm curious what your response would be.
Well, I think the early screening and diagnostics are absolutely necessary. We want to be very careful here. We don't want to mark people for life, But what we want to do is create a profile so that there can be intervention of some sort. Secondly, there's a parental movement, and the parental movement that was so present in 2021 in Virginia, right, elected a governor, and almost, to everybody's surprise, almost elected a governor in New Jersey. That movement's out there, and it's present in school district elections throughout the country. The parents need to be brought in. There is a sense that decisions are made by elitist state school officials, and they need to be heard.
Absolutely.
And they need to put their work where their mouth is. Okay, if we're going to deal with this problem, what do you have? What do you bring to the table?
Yeah, I think you'd be hard pressed to find anybody right now, or very few people, I think, who haven't had some type of interrelationship with kind of the role of mental health in their life, right? With themselves, with a family member, with a friend. It is one of those things that I think is and especially now with some of the destigmatization, I think we're able to have some of these more open discussions around it, or at least I hope that we are. How about John, we always like to ask guests, like, what's in your personal mental health toolkit in terms of how you relax, kind of take stress off, anything that you'd want to share kind of with our listenership here about the John Zogby handbook of stress management and mental health care?
I walk every day, unless there's a blizzard of some sort, then I walk in the house, and that annoys everybody. But on a normal day, I walk in the late morning, and then I've got my friend here that is my mental health coach.
Got it.
And I walk together, and that's very good for me. Also, I read novels. I have a day book, which is generally nonfiction, and then a late evening a book, novels that just both de-stresses me, or at least makes me feel, hey, my problems aren't as bad as this character's.
Got it. Any book recommendations that you'd like to share?
Oh, there are so many. I'm a huge fan of Michael Connelly, and John Grisham, of course. There are some you've never heard of. Jake Needham is wonderful, and now this is the senior moment. Ken Follett.
Oh, sure.
His historical novels are just magnificent.
Yeah, Pillars of the Earth and things like that.
Pillars
right?
of the Earth,
yeah.
And then he's got a 20th century.
Yeah.
Series,
those are good. Those are good for sure.
Yes.
Fall of Giants and all of those. So,
yes.
Yeah. Got it. I'm a Ken Follett fan as well. So thanks for sharing. Anything on the nonfiction front you want to share?
Yeah, I am. This is going to require some spelling here. Parag Khanna is a young millennial. Paragkhanna, writing about the next world. And so what he has written about is, one book is How to Run the World, a whole new paradigm for how decisions will be made independent of nation states. I like to think even further past. Another is called Connectography, where supply chains is, and the way we do finances, even before crypto, will transcend all national borders, is already doing that. So supply chains will require a change in how we do business, and how we structure our governments and communities. And then the book that I just finished now is called Move, and it is about the human value of migration. And so now we are seeing, and will continue to see, a giant uplift, like the southern hemisphere lifting up a carpet, and millions upon millions of people moving to the north. Climate change is doing that, in addition to opportunity.
Interesting. Great recommendations, John. Thanks for sharing those. And I want to thank you for your time. This has been incredibly helpful. More than anything, I want to thank you for partnering with us on this survey. Really hopeful that together we can just cast a bright light on some of the attitudes and beliefs of administrators and parents when it comes to school-based mental health. So we really appreciate you and your team and the opportunity to work with you on this.
Thank you, and we're on call, so let us know.
Sounds great.
Thank you so much. Good to meet you.
Thanks, John. Have a great rest of the day. Take care.
Bye-bye.
All right, Laine, final segment of the day. What inspired you this week? Anything that you want to share?
Yes, I do. So one of my coworkers here at ESS said to me a while back, you got to have LFTs, and that's look forward tos. He said,
I like that.
It's great to have, that's Frank Lechliger. Said to me, you got to have some LFT. So my LFT that's inspiring me to get through the rest of this week and even part of next week is I'm going off to Maui to visit my sister and her family. My son and I are going out there. And so we're going to have a Maui Christmas. And so I am just seeing myself on the beach and taking long walks and snorkeling. And that is helping me finish out strong this last part of December before I go on vacation.
Starting every morning with positive visualization of you in Maui.
I'm already in Maui mentally. It's just a couple of days in a plane ride away, and I will be there. 2 plane rides, as the case may be.
That sounds incredible. So, yeah, for me, and this is a non-school based mental health related one, but I had a chance to take 2 of my girls to a Philadelphia Eagles game, as you know, and you're a
EAGLES
there you go.
Eagles.
Yeah, so that was part of the inspiring piece for me. This is their first Eagles professional football game, kind of for each of them, and while at an Eagle
first game,
and so it's a mixed bag. I think at an Eagles game, you're going to see like your fair share of inebriations and things that like
all kinds of shenanigans.
Yeah, you don't necessarily want your kids seeing, but getting to go through and like having them like literally walk through the concourse and like have random people high-fiving them and spontaneous like EAGLES chants and the fly Eagles fly. So that was really cool. And so I mean the big picture for me, like sports has played watching sports and being a fan of teams has been something that has been like a constant in my life. So I used to live in Hawaii when I was in the Navy, and I remember 30 years ago waking up at like 6 a.m. to go watch an NFL game, and you could always walk into a restaurant or a bar kind of in Hawaii, and there's like you don't know anybody, but there's like the little corner of Eagles fans. So
that happened to me too.
Totally.
I was in Maui.
Right?
We found a bar. There's Eagles bars all over the country, believe it or not.
Yeah. But to me, it's like, why do we watch sports? Why do we torture ourselves? I actually find like a lot of my time spent watching sports, it's kind of unpleasant. I don't actually enjoy it. It's like, this torturous type of process. But I think you do it for connection, and I love that connection aspect of it, and I love the fact that my kids got to experience that. So that was really cool. Yeah.
That is cool.
Okay, well, really excited for us to get the chance to speak with John Zogby today. Laine, always a pleasure seeing you. And thank you, dear listener, for joining in on another episode of the Mindbeat podcast. And we hope you are enjoying it. This is our third-ish episode right now. And we welcome any feedback. Please feel free to reach out to us on social or via our Effective School Solutions website. And we thank all of you for what you're doing each and every day to support the mental health of students and family members and the staff members that are serving and supporting them. Have a great day.
Bye, everybody. The Mindbeat podcast is a production of Effective School Solutions. Mindbeat represents the opinions of Duncan Young, Laine Whitaker, and their guests on the show. The content here should not be taken as medical advice. The content here is for informational purposes only. Please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions. This podcast should not be used in any legal capacity whatsoever, including but not limited to establishing a standard of care, in a legal sense or as a basis for expert witness testimony. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on this podcast. If you or someone you know is experiencing a mental health crisis, please call the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, the SAMHSA National Helpline at 1-800-662-HELP, or your local healthcare provider.